Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to our friends in the Eastern time zones. My name is Murray Ross, and I'm Vice President and Director of the Kaiser Permanente Institute for Health Policy, and I'll be your moderator today. On behalf of UC Irvine Center for Healthcare Management and Policy, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final day of the conference. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and a special thank you to the conference sponsors who make it possible for us to be here today. There's a certain challenge in being the last session of a conference. We've already had 2 fantastic days, and I'm sure a lot of your heads are spinning with energy and ideas. But I think this session will rise to that challenge with a great set of speakers covering some fascinating content. Before we turn to that, I just want to acknowledge the gravity of what's taking place in Ukraine right now. I grew up in Canada with a lot of people whose names ended in Chuck. Canada has the 2nd largest diaspora of Ukrainians in the world, and been trying to find the right balance between worrying about their distant cousins and staying focused on my job. So for the next 2 hours, I'm going to mute CNN and Twitter and moderate this panel. Our panel is going to focus on the changing business of healthcare. Healthcare delivery models in the US are changing. Some of that change has been driven by the COVID-19 pandemic and the challenge of delivering care in person. Telehealth use has grown rapidly but unevenly, with some markets and some care needs faring better than others. Some of the changes predate the pandemic as providers consolidate to leverage economies of scale and scope, but also to improve their bargaining position. And some of the changes reflect new business models, whether ownership or operational, seeking to improve efficiency in care delivery. This session is going to describe these changes, examine their prevalence, and explore their impact on access to care, affordability, and equity. A little bit of housekeeping here. Audio is muted for all attendees, and we do ask that you submit questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we really want you to submit questions. We've got lots of time for it. You may use the same Zoom link for each day of the conference, which doesn't matter now since we're on the 3rd day. Speaker presentations will be available to view and download from the Whova conference app. You should have received an email from Whova a while back. Link for the conference recording will be emailed to you after the conference. And those wanting to earn physicians' CMEs, complete the survey, which will be emailed to you after the conference. And I'll just note that we want to hear from everybody else as well. We'll hear from our keynote speaker, Ipsita Smolinski. She's Managing Director at Capital Street, a Washington, D.C. consultancy that advises clients on policy and markets. Her full biography is on the website. And I think her presentation will be a great bookend to Dean Rosen's, connecting the broad policy environment with its impact for specific stakeholders. We'll have time for questions after her presentation. So again, I invite you to submit them in the Q&A function. And after her presentation and Q&A, we will turn to our distinguished panel. So without further ado, take it away, Ipsita.
Hi, thank you so much for having me to UC Irvine. Murray, thank you for that kind introduction. Ipsita Smolinski, Capital Street. Yes, we have a healthcare consulting firm based in Washington, D.C., and really we are at the intersection of policy and how all of these regulations and laws impact companies, whether you're a hospital, a health insurer. There's real ramifications, biotech, pharma, medtech. So I also teach at Hopkins at the Johns Hopkins Carey School. And our clients are hospital systems, again, CEOs, C-suites, healthcare investors. We have trade associations. That's not the view we want, is it? Sorry about that. All right, much better. So we're gonna split the discussion, the 20 minutes that I have here. And again, we welcome your questions. So send those over to Murray or throw them in the chat, but really just wanna first talk about the environment today. Here we are almost in March of 2022, and then focus on healthcare services, which we put kind of hospitals, physicians, and health plans in that bucket, and then move forward to healthcare products, which of course is biotech, pharma, medical devices, and all of those lovely things. So as far as healthcare services, what do we expect in 2022? Of course, moving away from fee for service and paying for value. In fact, we saw a announcement out of CMMI yesterday on value-based care, revamping a pilot program that really puts the primary care physicians at the forefront of care. Medicare Advantage has been a very popular program with seniors. These are plans like Humana, United, CVS, Anthem, that actually serve seniors. Seniors, almost 50% of them are in an MA plan, but there is some concern over risk score growth, and we could see some audits and so forth going forward. Price transparency, that's like motherhood and apple pie. Who doesn't want to know how much an MRI costs at their local hospital down the street, or perhaps they have to go across town or to an academic medical? Is something that we see is going forward no matter who's in the White House. Telehealth, of course, really saved the day during COVID and will likely be extended. We think about 2 years in the upcoming March bill, but telepsych, telehealth to augment the in-person visits has really been quite wonderful. Health equity is pervading all of policymaking, making sure that underrepresented populations are adequately served. Of course, COVID really brought out those disparities. And then drug pricing reform, of course, prices are too high. Congress continues to try to tackle that, and hopefully we'll see some action here in the next 12 months. Midterms, of course, when there is an election year, legislation kind of grinds to a halt, but we think we could see some action into the summer. And I'll go ahead and talk about what some of that legislative action could be in healthcare. If the Democrats lose in the midterm election, House, Senate, or both, we could actually see an active lame duck session. That's the session after the election, so sort of November, December, before the new Congress is sworn in. You might have heard the term BBB, Build Back Better. That was a bill that was last year kind of halted. It started at $3.5 trillion, then it went to $2 trillion. We wouldn't call it dead yet, but there are some healthcare provisions in there that could see the light of day. Again, probably by May, June timeframe is when we would see something like this pass. As Murray mentioned, there are a lot of issues geopolitical going on. It's hard to actually see BBB passing right now. It's not really a topic of conversation on the Hill, but I would say that those subsidies that Congress gave to Americans to buy premiums, buy care on the marketplace in the exchange during COVID has been very popular. So we could see those subsidies last. They sunset at the end of 2022. And then to offset that, how do you pay for those new benefits? The drug reforms. Again, those would likely go hand in hand. Maybe we see some climate provisions. We don't think that the Medicaid coverage in those 12 states that didn't expand Medicaid, we don't think that'll happen. And there was also talk of adding a hearing benefit to Medicare, fee-for-service Medicare, which at this point doesn't cover hearing, vision, or dental, but that benefit is likely not to make it. We're in a year where the agencies are really getting to work. NIH, FDA, CMS, CMMI. We could see executive orders, we could see regulations. So really keep an eye on the agencies. I wanted to talk about CMMI, which is a laboratory that was passed with the Affordable Care Act. And the leader of CMMI is a woman who actually, over 10 years ago, worked to draft the Affordable Care Act. So now 10, 11 years later, she's at the helm trying to design payment pilots and demonstrations. And one thing the group has been very vocal about is providing that patient-centric, whole person accountable care, where primary care sits very heavily and reduces downstream costs in an ideal world, so that everybody in Medicare, and the marketplace would be in some kind of an accountable model by 2030. And there's actually a paper that CMMI put out that talks about all of this, which I recommend reading if that's your line of work. And it aligns with, of course, value-based care. Medicare Advantage, just wanted to mention, these are the plans that are paid very generously by the government. $1,000 PMPM. A lot of the publicly traded insurers are in the MA program, CVS, Humana, United. Seniors love this program. They get their vision, they get their dental, they get their silver sneakers through MA. And the rates for 2023 are very generous, but there is a concern that the plans are upcoding a bit to get the additional payments. So that's a policy that we could see going forward on MA. Back in January, when we did a 2022 Outlook webinar for our clients, we talked about how what always keeps this job fun is that there are always surprises. And we actually pointed to the direct contracting program. This is a CMMI pilot. I apologize, I'm using the administration, under the prior administration, started a direct contracting pilot, and some progressives had been concerned over the last few months that it turned into profiteering from some of the publicly traded companies. Of course, there are private companies that participate in direct contracting as well. And we saw, lo and behold, last night, some reforms that came from CMMI to make this program a little bit more equitable, make sure that these organizations that are participating do have significant physician leadership and board membership. So we thought some real common sense reforms came out of that series of modifications that came out last night. And the companies there are Oak Street, Agilon, there's many of them, Keynote. On how the policy backdrop is going to impact various industries going forward. So these are some pretty little arrows and such that talk about where we are on hospitals, on plans, and on physicians. And then I'll pivot over to the product side. But on hospitals, you know, look, the ACA is here to stay. There are many more covered lives, which of course helps hospital payments, of course, less of the uncompensated care that comes through the ER. COVID was rough on hospitals, but there were provider relief payments that went out the door. There won't be the Medicaid extension or expansion, I should say, in the states that didn't expand Medicaid. So on balance, probably a bit of a neutral outlook for hospitals. Hospitals, by the way, in fact, one of the publicly traded companies reported this morning, they're really going into freestanding ED, anything that's outpatient, surgery centers, a lot of those lower cost settings is where you're seeing these hospital companies convert inpatient beds to outpatient beds. And that kind of aligns with the value-based care thesis that we're seeing in the private markets and now within the government. Plans, of course, the exchange, the marketplace, this is what was created through the Affordable Care Act. This administration and Congress has really bolstered payments, the subsidies I was mentioning. So we have a positive outlook on the exchange plans. Managed Medicaid, same thing. You know, we are seeing redeterminations come back. This is the policy where states have to ensure that every single person on Medicaid is appropriately in Medicaid, i.e. if their income or their status has changed, they might actually lose their Medicaid benefit and would likely move over to an exchange plan. But so redeterminations are certainly something that concern the Medicaid plans, Centene, Molina, and there are many others, United and Anthem. MA, I talked about it a great deal, so I'll just go through this briefly. Very popular program, almost 50% of Medicare enrollees are enrolled in a plan. There is concern over risk score growth, which is this idea that beneficiaries are tagged as having multiple comorbidities to garner that higher payment, that higher reimbursement rate from the government, some of which might be slightly exaggerated to get that additional remuneration. Physicians direct contracting, you know, there's this primary care focus, that CMMI, Center for Innovation demonstration that's been tweaked to really make sure that patients are being served by their primary care docs and that the care is managed home health and post-acute. I didn't go into great detail, but home health is something that, of course, low odds of infections if you're in a home health setting versus in the hospital, lower cost setting. So something that we view as a positive policy outlook. MedPAC is a board of advisors that provides policy recommendations to the Congress and to CMS. They're concerned that home health agencies, rehab hospitals, and even nursing homes have double-digit margins, but we don't really think that those payments and policies will really negatively impact the home health industries. There's a lot of supporters in Congress for home health. All right, let's move over to biotech and pharma along with some other technologies, and then I welcome your questions now or during the session at the end after all of my fellow panelists speak. So biotech and pharma, we have a new FDA commissioner. His name is Rob Califf. He's got some real ideas as far as bringing credibility back to the FDA. We just, of course, had COVID. A lot of products were approved under emergency use and wants to kind of restore the FDA's reputation. We're seeing some really exciting technologies. You may remember that the COVID vaccine from Pfizer and from Moderna was mRNA technology. We're seeing those same technologies being applied to cancer care and other therapies. So we're keeping our eye on that. And then I'll go into this in the next slide, but where companies are actually going straight to health centers to try, and health systems, that is, to try to get volume-based pricing for innovative therapies. Novartis is doing this with one of their medicines that prevents heart attack. Drug pricing reform always hangs in the balance. I would say that those policies in the BBB aren't terribly draconian, and that most drug makers can probably navigate through BBB. Again, if those policies pass, I'll go into those in the next slide or two. And then on the medical technology side, diagnostics, these are things like stents and implantable devices, diagnostic tests. There's so many exciting new technologies, liquid biopsy for cancer screening, synthetic biology, for deferred care, excuse me. And the hospitals and providers have more tools in the toolbox, really, with antivirals, so that folks are going back to healthcare settings to have procedures performed. Creative reimbursement models we're seeing with Novartis, for instance, they went straight to Geisinger and to other systems to say, hey, look, there's a lot of options when it comes to cardiovascular care. We'll provide a volume-based discount for you if our new product is kind of first or second line therapy. So keep an eye out for more creative reimbursement models. I see that I'm kind of running up on my 20 minutes, so I'll get through these last few slides here. But drug reform, measured BBB, Build Back Better, has sort of a three-pronged approach to drug reform, which are inflationary rebates, restructuring the Medicare Part D benefit, D as in David, and then negotiating drugs. The Medicare program does not currently have the ability to negotiate drug prices. Most of your friends, most of your neighbors would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Congress is, but that's a part of the law. Congress is trying to change that, so at least a subset of very expensive products can be negotiated, and we'll see if that crosses the finish line this year. Of course, if it does, you'll see drug makers shift their R&D strategy to medicines in a younger population, perhaps orphan drugs. We have a few bills that should get passed by the end of the year, the FDA User Fee Bill and Cures 2.0. These are generally industry-friendly pieces of legislation that will likely pass with bipartisan support. So that's kind of third quarter, fourth quarter of this year, but would be helpful to device makers biotech, pharma. We mentioned on medical technologies and supplies, really a positive environment for them. Hospitals are coping with COVID. Of course, COVID didn't create a nursing shortage or therapist shortage, but certainly the public health emergency didn't help. There are supply chain and inflationary pressures. Reimbursement always is a headwind. You know, will your technology get the J code or the G code that it needs to get reimbursed by Medicare is always concerning, but companies are, you know, they're coming equipped to CMS with their dossier of information and clinical evidence to get that coverage. We have an FDA commissioner, so we have CMS, head of Medicare, CMMI, HHS, of course. The last, I would say, well, I guess NIH, we still don't have a leader for the National Institutes of Health, but Rob Califf is a name you may have heard. He was the Food and Drug Commissioner under Obama in the second term, really wants to give medical reviewers more autonomy. We could see him creating a Center for Excellence for cardiovascular, for neurology. He did work with Alphabet, with Verily, so really likes the idea of smartphones and being able to track patients, real world evidence for clinical trial participants. And he's a big fan of accelerated approvals, which was the way that Aduhelm, the Alzheimer's drug, was approved. But really making sure that manufacturers are providing those post-approval confirmatory clinical trials. That's one of his priorities. And then I'll just go through the sort of positive, negative, and neutral. We're a bit neutral on biotech and pharma because of this overhang from price reforms. Of course, payers with formularies, with step therapy. ICER in Cambridge, up in Massachusetts, there's a lot of payer power as far as the usage and access to some of these therapies. And then you've got BBB, Build Back Better, hanging in the balance. I can skip over dialysis, but we don't see very many risks. These are companies like Fresenius for DaVita with a movement towards the home. Like the rest of the world, does quite a bit of home dialysis versus in-center. PBMs, the middleman, are often vilified in the drug pricing debate. The truth is that a health insurer couldn't start a new health plan without one. So they do provide a very important role. And we on the PBMs, medical technologies and devices, pretty positive policy outlook from a reimbursement perspective and from a trend perspective with procedures coming back, and then even some policies that could pass in that FDA and that Cures bill later in the year. And then finally, with our last slide here is on clinical labs and diagnostics. Of course, Quest and LabCorp, independent labs, reference labs really saved the day, processing a lot of those COVID tests. There was some legislation that was delayed by 1 year called PAMA. That was helpful to the industry. Advanced tests seem to be reimbursed fairly generously, and there's an effort in the Congress to cover, for Medicare to cover, that is multi-cancer early detection or legislation that's moved through the Congress and could pass later this year. So with that, I realized that was a mouthful and that was a lot of information, but I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to your questions and comments, and I look forward to a dialogue.
Great. Thank you, Ipsita. And let me see if my camera is coming back on. Yeah, I have a host of questions. I know we're getting a few in the Q&A, and I'll just remind the audience to please submit there. But just to sort of get things going, and we're going to touch on it a little bit more in the next session, but this sort of, you hinted at how the different sectors are thinking about rebound care, the stuff that was deferred or delayed during COVID. And so good for device manufacturers, good for hospitals, getting people back in. Payers have to figure out how much of that there's going to be. How are they thinking about it? Or are they? I mean, they must be thinking about it.
So insurers, good question. The questions about deferred care, it's all coming back. I mean, I think that for the most part, insurers have done quite well during the pandemic, to be quite honest, because you remember at the beginning, a lot of those optional surgeries were halted. Now they are coming back, so medical costs will go up. But if you look at even the most recent fourth quarter earnings results, they were quite strong, medical loss ratios and so forth. So I think insurers are also, you'll hear quite a bit of discussion from United Health, from Optum about value-based care. And a lot of insurers, I want to point out, are employing physicians and, kind of moving to have everything under one roof, as far as the primary care doc, avoiding, the costly ER visit later, and specialist care. Of course, if it's needed, it's needed. But those are some trends that we're seeing from insurers.
And then you tiptoed over the user fee agreements. So we have 4 of these coming through, right? The prescription drug, the PDUFAs, the generic drugs, the devices, and biosimilars. And I know there's been some conversation, because we've actually contributed to it, about whether there's an opportunity here to strengthen some of the requirements around post-marketing commitments and post-market requirements. And for those who don't know, those are FDA authority when they bring, the FDA can use when a drug comes through under its accelerated approval pathway to say, you didn't have time to do the full clinical trial, or you didn't have a large enough trial, or whatever the case may be. So we want you to do follow-up. And there's evidence out there that follow-up isn't actually taking place. So my question is twofold. You mentioned Rob Califf sort of being interested in that. Do you think he'll have any success following through? And then the other part of it is, and if not, is the Congress likely to do anything?
So good question. Every 5 years, we've been doing this a long time, but every 5 years there's a user fee agreement, because industry pays fees to the FDA to evaluate and ultimately approve or not approve their drug, their generic, their biosimilar, or their device. And every 5 years, I should say, Congress says, well, this is going to be a clean user fee agreement. So Murray, I think you're right. There will be some accelerated approval reforms. This is this idea that, if there is a product addressing an unmet need, think about Biogen, think about Aduhelm, the Alzheimer's treatment that was approved and kind of controversially approved, had a pretty high price tag of $56,000, and then that was cut in half right before Christmas. And then CMS said, look, we're not going to cover it. Not outright non-coverage, but very restrictive coverage requirements for it to be reimbursed. And as you can imagine, Alzheimer's is a disease of the elderly. So that's largely Medicare, not Medicaid. And one of the arguments is that manufacturers don't necessarily complete their confirmatory trials. So I think, yes, Murray, either Califf and or legislators will look to provide perhaps more of a requirement to really get those done. And, manufacturers know already that the microscope is on them to do them. So it's almost like drug pricing. Companies are really reticent to obnoxiously price a product because they'll be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. So they're kind of policing themselves.
Ipsita, you broke up a little bit there. Okay. There's a question in the chat about Medicaid, and the question is, I'm just going to read it to you.
Sure.
You can see it too. Any insights on what is happening across the country with respect to providing recuperative care for the Medicaid population, such as the homeless?
Did you say recuperative?
Yes.
Care? I think with Medicaid, you're seeing by some states, not all, a effort to address the social determinants. Of course, we all know that if you're an asthmatic, that the best solution might be putting in the window air conditioner, right? It's not. there's cleaner air. So this is a thing that Medicare, CMS has embraced. Even the folks in Baltimore realize this, and they're allowing Medicare Advantage plans to offer food, transportation. And I think the question that's being asked, it's in the same vein as far as Medicaid. The plans are addressing these social determinants, and some more than others, but certainly the CEOs, I've heard them speak at conferences over the years. I mean, they're finding folks under bridges. These are people with real severe mental health needs, psychological needs. So I think that's certainly, I can't say a trend nationally, but in certain places, and in some ways more of a private sector initiative to really capture those folks and manage them effectively.
Going back to my list, you managed to get all the way to the end before you said supply chain, which is my favorite buzzword. I mean, that's one thing COVID taught us, is that we can't rely on an extended supply chain that is sort of everything just in time and subject to all sorts of delays, whether they're political or Suez Canal related. Are there any serious discussions of sort of supply chain, like reshoring, hardening, I guess is another term people use? Or how much of that is going to be up to companies versus, a federal policy?
So supply chain, you're right. It's something that we learned during COVID, that we can't get 90% of our rubber gloves from Malaysia, right? Like we need some more near shore versus offshore, China and India and Asia type solutions. There are some grants and things being offered to companies to, locate in the US. I can think of some success stories around that. In Baltimore, a company taking over an old Bethlehem steel factory and getting federal dollars to do that and to provide some of those important supplies to the strategic national stockpile. I think some tax incentives would be helpful too. And I think overall, you're right, we'll probably see some supply chain reforms stuck into that FDA User Fee Bill, which will likely have the user fees, the cures, this like sort of bipartisan life sciences friendly bill, and even so I think that a lot of that pandemic preparedness will include supply chain. I would keep an eye on Richard Furr, Patty Murray of the Senate Health Committee. They put out a nice paper and a nice piece of legislation addressing the supply chain. So I think we'll see some reforms later this year.